is Cheney Ryan. I'm a professor in the law school. I teach in the conflict resolution program and a professor in the philosophy department. I am the co-chair of the Carnegie Global Ethics Initiative. This is a brand new initiative that is based out of New York City, actually. And it is beginning this year. We are going to network together universities throughout the globe to do educational activities and also to engage in common research projects. It's sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, but the University of Oregon is one of the first two co-sponsors that signed on, and we are also, I think, the leading school, I could say, in terms of the work that we're doing with students at the University of Oregon. The long-term vision here, as I said, is just getting going, is that campuses like the U of O will have projects, learning communities, engaging students in issues of ethics, international affairs, social justice, peace, oppression, et cetera, We will use the Carnegie Network to engage in a dialogue across continents, across time zones, with people from vastly different backgrounds, students from vastly different concerns, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a brand new project. We're very excited about it, and I honestly think, I know for a fact, the president of Carnegie says that the University of Oregon really is sort of the leader right now in the kind of work that we're doing. Thanks, I should say, really entirely Professor Cheryl Cohen, who has played such a great role in putting this together. So I'd like to welcome everybody tonight, and I'll turn it over to Professor Cohen.
Thank you, Cheney. Before I begin, I want to offer some additional remarks of appreciation. We are, in many respects, student-driven, and we thrive on the labor that students contribute. So some names need to be mentioned specially. So Johanna Luttrell, Katie Dwyer, and Leslie McLeese have worked, graduate students, to bring this event and the events surrounding it together and to sustain us as we move from activity to activity. And they and we on the faculty have very much enjoyed welcoming a new cohort of students to the university, many of them here. They've been at the University of Oregon for not even 4 complete weeks, and yet they have launched themselves remarkably quickly into matters of real concern, and they've brought a true sense of depth and commitment to the issues that we who are engaging in the pursuit of global ethics, international ethics, hold to be central to liberal arts education. We're already very proud of them. They're going to do great things here at the university, and we're looking forward to a collaboration with the students and networking with students and faculty elsewhere in the years ahead. For this year, is our first event under the Carnegie rubric that is for the general public, and we're glad to see you here as well. We are fortunate to have Sister Helen Prejean with us for a week, almost a week, in the fall of the year as she was last year and will be next year, and hopefully will be off into the future. And she has brought to us a very intense message of human rights, of justice, of caring, and of love. When I greeted her this afternoon, I told her that though I never went to Catholic school, it makes me feel guilty to see a nun, because we make her work so hard. And she said she wanted me to feel joy when I see her, and actually I do feel joy when I see her. And we are working her very hard, and we're fortunate to have her here with us. Tonight we're going to be focusing on some of the ethics and politics of the international dimension of the death penalty. What does it mean for the United States to be operating the way it's operating here in terms of our position in the world? And what does it mean for the way that we engage other countries and their issues of human rights and justice, given the fact that they're looking at what happens here in the United States, and they're seeing this record of capital punishment that is growing longer and has many troubling dimensions to it. So there has been through the week some discussion about the death penalty. Tonight we're bringing it to that specific component of the international dimension and how that ties up with politics and with ethics. And joining Sister Helen on our panel tonight will be Greg Kirkendall. Greg is in Arizona, and we're glad that he was able to join us. And we're hoping that the Skype will function effectively throughout. And I'm going to let each of our speakers introduce themselves to you, so I won't tell you much about who this is. They'll tell you themselves. But Greg served as a legal counsel to the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs as director of the Mexican Capital Legal Assistance Program. And he brings expertise from his practice generally and more specifically to some of the questions that we're interested in tonight. And Terry Rodello, here in the room with us, is the Oregon Death Penalty Abolition Coordinator for Amnesty International. So her work is throughout the state of Oregon, and she networks with Amnesty in the United States and then, of course, internationally in their effort to draw attention to the death penalty and to work towards its abolition. Sister Helen, I think, doesn't really need an introduction. She's known for her writing and for her work in relation to the death penalty. She is really tireless and is a model for all of us of courage and determination around these issues. The way that we're going to work this evening is we're going to hear first from Terry and then from Greg and then from Sister Helen about 5 minutes just on their biography, how they came to their work and what it involves. When each of them has had an opportunity to tell you a little bit about themselves and their work, I'm going to ask them to address a particular issue, and then because we want you to have the opportunity to engage them, at that point we'll open it up to questions. So that should be the bulk of the evening, is your dialogue with these three people who have a lot of experience and a lot of dedication in relation to broad concerns of the death penalty, human rights, and justice. Okay? So, Terry, could you start us off, please?
Good evening. I want to thank you for this opportunity to participate in this panel discussion and to discuss the international abolitionist movement. I'm honored to be here and to be among such distinguished guests. My name is Terry Rodello, as you already know, and my role is to be the Oregon State Death Penalty Abolition Coordinator for Amnesty International. The abolition of the death penalty in the United States and in the world is a priority of Amnesty International. My role is to work with Amnesty International members, supporters, student groups, as well as other abolition groups in Oregon to abolish the death penalty in Oregon. Outside, there is the group Oregonians for Alternatives to Death Penalty. Those are one of the key groups that I'm on their board, and I work with them. I'm a volunteer, or as I call myself, a pro bono consultant. They would have to pay an awful lot of money to some of us volunteers, given what we do. My job as a programmer pays for my volunteer work. I've been an active member of Amnesty International since 1989 and have held various other leadership positions for different issues and individuals at risk. I've been actively involved with the Oregon death penalty issue since 1999, and since 2005, I've been on the board of Oregonians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, the Oregon affiliate of the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. We are actively working to build the movement necessary to abolish the death penalty in Oregon. Currently, there are 36 men and 1 woman on Oregon's death row. At this time, Gary Haugen, an inmate on death row, wants to volunteer to be executed, and it is tentatively scheduled for December 6th. But the Oregon Capital Resource Center has filed a writ with the Oregon Supreme Court to protest this execution. Both Amnesty International and Oregonians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty oppose all executions, even if the inmate volunteers. We will do all we can to prevent his state-sanctioned death. During my time with Amnesty International, as I said, I've worked on different international human rights issues and for the release of many individuals. The issue of the death penalty hasn't always been a personal priority. I didn't support the death penalty, but I didn't oppose it either. That is until I learned much more about it. I think this is the experience of many Amnesty members, supporters, and the general public. Somehow, if you support the abolition of the death penalty, it means you're supporting the murderer. I have since learned there's much more to it. But as I learned more and more about it, my views changed. I realized that it is a basic violation of human rights and also my core values. This isn't on my notes, but since someone mentioned it, the Catholic school education. I was raised Catholic, and I'm Jesuit educated. I went to a Jesuit college in California, and it's something about it. Once it's in you, and the sense of justice and what's right and wrong, it's stuck. I no longer am a practicing Catholic. I've been informed I'm a fallen Catholic. However, I do believe that I do live what my teachings through Amnesty International. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in December 1948 in response to the crimes and human rights abuses during World War II, is the foundation document for Amnesty International, and it embodies its core principles that mirror my own. Article 3 recognizes that each person has a right to life. Article 5 states, no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel or degrading treatment or punishment. As a member of Amnesty International, a citizen of the United States and the world community, and a human being, I believe the death penalty violates these rights and must be abolished. I look forward to the discussion tonight. Thank you. Was that okay?
Okay, Greg, please.
Hey, thanks. It's a privilege to be here, and or to be where you all are. It's not a privilege to be where I am. I really do appreciate the invitation, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person. In terms of an introduction, I have the privilege of being a lawyer, and I've been a criminal defense lawyer for about 25 years, and about 10 or 12 years ago, in the course of defending a Mexican national who was accused of a death penalty crime, I got the attention of the Mexican government, the local Mexican consulate, and shortly after that I began working in a program that began in the year 2000 called the Mexican Capital Legal Assistance Program. And before I go any further, can you all hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, good. It's an odd feeling to be watching this computer, and my lips aren't moving at the same rate on the screen as I'm hearing. Be that as it may, basically what happened was the Mexican government recognized that Mexican nationals arrested and accused of the death penalty in the United States were at a severe disadvantage as compared to everybody else that's accused of the death penalty. And it's not simply an official recognition of racism, but it's also an official recognition of xenophobia amongst jurors, prosecutors, police officers, and unfortunately, defense lawyers. And as a consequence of all this, the Mexican government set up this program with the awkward name of the Mexican Capital Legal Assistance Program, with an idea toward essentially creating a group of experienced capital defense lawyers who would act as consultants for the most part, and work with appointed lawyers at all stages of death penalty proceedings involving Mexican nationals. And by all stages, I mean from the moment that they're arrested throughout the pretrial proceeding until clemency proceeding and everything in between. During the course of this, I think in 2005 or 2006, I took over as the director. And since that time, we've completed almost 700 cases. We've had more cases than that are still pending. we have in the neighborhood of 165 cases at any given time at the pretrial stage, and we have approximately 60 people on death row that are Mexicans and are scattered throughout the United States, principally in California and Texas, but several other states as well. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm what we call in the law a dirty shirt lawyer that does primarily courtroom advocacy and jail visitations and that kind of stuff, the rumpled sort of thing. But I've also gotten to work in The Hague with a team of lawyers that Mexico dispatched to sue the United States, and then to go back and ask for what we call provisional measures in the Hague, but that really means more like a temporary restraining order. And we've also got a lobbying effort going in front of the federal Congress in an attempt to implement the judgment that we won over in The Hague. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but that's how I fit into your program, and I appreciate you inviting me.
Thanks, Greg, and we appreciate you dealing with the technical part of things. Mr. Helen, please.
Well, I guess if Greg is a dirty shirt lawyer, I must be a dirty habit nun. In there with people on death row, in there with people and trying to, once you realize something's wrong, then you know you gotta do something and you can't stop until it's done. Commitment is a mysterious thing in a way when we catch on fire for something, whether it's human rights or whatever it is, and that's what happened to me. Not knowing anything about the death penalty. I got to get my water. Not knowing anything about any of the social justice issues. For me, it was an awakening through my faith. For a long time, I thought faith, Christianity, Jesus, was about being charitable to everybody. Mostly to people who are in the little tidal pool right around me. But people who are poor, people who are in the inner city, much less people in other parts of the world. I thought, well, that's too big for me. I can't be connected to those people. And by descending into poverty in New Orleans, in the inner city, and letting African Americans be my teachers because I grew up in privilege in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And my daddy was a successful lawyer, and the only way I knew African American people during the days of deep segregation was as our servants. I didn't even know the last names of the woman, Ellen, who worked in the house, and Jesse, who worked in the yard. Mom and Daddy were always kind to them. But I had never even heard the word justice. And, you know, the Catholic Church has a deep tradition of social justice. But to have that awakened in the church and active in the church has been a whole other thing. And in the Catholic Church, Pope John the 23rd, he's the little rotund pope that smoked cigarettes and introduced Vatican II to bring the church into the modern world. And we had never had a council like that wasn't aimed at blaming other people for their heresies. This was purely to get the Catholic Church to relate to the world and to see the needs of the world. And he wrote what's called an encyclical. It's a pastoral letter about concerns about social and moral issues that was called Pacem in Terris, Peace in the World. He wrote it in 1963, and in it, Pope John the 23rd pointed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was going to be the beacon for all of us. And indeed, that has been my experience. So when I first woke up to the issues of justice, the first people with me marching on the road, the first people with me who were part of vigils to raise awareness of the death penalty in Louisiana, where when I began, 87% of the people in Louisiana supported the death penalty. Legislature solidly locked in, governors running on the death penalty, prosecutors running for office on the death penalty. The ones who were by my side and my first teachers were Amnesty International. I learned about human rights through Amnesty International. And they were my teachers. They taught me about how human rights, excuse me, are inalienable. You can't alienate a human right out of a person, which means that governments don't give human rights to people for good behavior, and they can't take it away for bad behavior. So the right to life. Well, what about for a very bad crime? Can't governments take the life of people for a very bad crime? And hence, there you go. We get into it. Human rights are inalienable. And that and torture and cruel and degrading punishment. So because I had worked closely with the death penalty and accompanied already 4 people to execution, when Abu Ghraib happened and people were being tortured, I had already witnessed it happening with the death penalty. Because, as I was saying to some students earlier today in the anthropology class, everybody's nightmare on death row is the same nightmare. It's my time to go. The guards are coming for me. They're bringing me out of my cell, and I'm kicking and I'm screaming, going, no, no, no. And then I wake up, and I look around, and I'm in my cell. It's not my time. It was a dream. Because human beings have consciousness and imagination and begin to anticipate what's going to happen to them, their death. Will they have the courage for their knees not to buckle, to be able to walk? All of those things. Not to mention the suffering of their family, their mothers going through this with them. So human rights is the road where all of us, religious, non-religious, and all can come together in common accord, that people shouldn't be tortured and people shouldn't receive cruel and degrading punishment and people should not be killed. And that is the discussion. Now, I have the experience now of 20 years on the road with the American public talking about this. And when I first got into it, I really thought it was going to be, what's the Spanish, mano a mano, hand to hand? I mean, I thought I'd have to battle my way into every group of people just to get a hearing. And I wrote the book, and it came out, the movie came out. That really helped get the discourse going. But in audiences, you know what I have found most of all? It's not that people have thought about the death penalty deeply and decided to be for it. They've never thought about it. It's all very, very surface. And you know, Thurgood Marshall, first African-American we ever had on Supreme Court, said a long time ago, you know, the American people, those that say they accept the death penalty, educate the people about the death penalty, bring them close to it, and they're going to reject the death penalty. It's called the Marshall Hypothesis. And I found it to be absolutely and totally true. If we can bring people close, we can educate them about the death penalty. Most people do not want to kill a fellow human being. And what's manipulated in them easily is fear. That they're made to think this is a very, I'm really sorry about this. It's a very dangerous world, and we got to get these murderers before they get us. And then that and politics. It's the easiest political symbol in the world to show you're tough on crime. I'm for the death penalty, and my opponent isn't. So I'm strong against crime, and my opponent is soft on crime. And now, much more, as the discourse has been developing, we're coming to understand we have to be smart about crime, and that it's intimately related to poverty. So when we can be freed of the death penalty, it's a diversionary tactic to some extent. It involves tremendous suffering of human beings. But it's a diversionary tactic. Everybody's looking over here. Are we going to get Timothy McVeigh? Are we going to get him? Are we going to get him? Meanwhile, the number of our poor people are now 49 million, and people are going to hell in a handbasket in our inner cities, and crime and guns and drugs, and we're not addressing the root problems. So I'd like to throw that out for starters. Thank you.
So we're going to try to have Greg join us while the connection is good. Greg, can you hear?
I can hear. I lose you sometimes, but I can hear.
Okay, so hopefully you'll stay with us. Greg, could you speak to us about a particular individual or case or aspect of the international dimension of the death penalty that you find particularly troubling or particularly useful in educating us about what's going on in this respect? And we have about 5 minutes for that.
Sure. Let me know if you lose me and I'll call you back. All right. I kind of glossed over this in the introduction that I was making, but one of the things that has happened in the international law aspect of what Mexico has done is Mexico sued the United States some time ago on behalf of 53 Mexicans that at that time were on death rows throughout the United States. And the reason that Mexico sued was because of those 53 Mexicans, none of them had been advised of their right to contact their consul, their local consul at the time that they were arrested. And as a consequence of not contacting their consul, the consul never knew that they were arrested, oftentimes until not only they had been convicted and sentenced to death, but some of them had been deep into their appeals and habeas corpus proceedings before the Mexican consulate ever became aware that they were on death row. What the treaty, the operative treaty, is called the Vienna Convention on Consular Rights, and Article 36 of that treaty says that whenever a foreign national is arrested, the police, as soon as they know or have reason to know that that person is a foreign national, are obligated to advise them of their right to talk to their consulate. And this is a treaty that's been signed by it's either 174 or 172 countries. I always get it mixed up. The United States and Mexico are signatories to this, but frankly, most other countries are signatories to it as well. I mean, it's really a basic right that if you're arrested in another country and they think that you're American, then they have an obligation to let you know that you can contact the American consulate and get help from them. Unfortunately for these 53 Mexicans, Mexico never did know. And the program that I run right now is essentially a branch of the consulate for Mexico that provides the assistance that we would have provided had we known about these folks being arrested in the first place. So after a good long while of diplomatic negotiations, Mexico went to the International Court of Justice, and so did the United States. And they had what can only be described as a fair fight. That is, the United States agreed to be bound by the decision of the International Court of Justice, and under some treaties and provisions that have to do with the founding of the International Court of Justice, which is the judicial branch of the United Nations, the ground rules were agreed upon, and we had a trial. And after the trial, the court held that the U.S. won some parts, the Mexicans won some other parts, and the remedy was that each one of those 53 Mexicans, the remedy that was in the order, were to have a hearing where a court, not George Bush or anybody else, but a court would determine whether they had suffered some type of prejudice by virtue of not having had the right to contact their consulate. So all of this happened back in 2003, 2004. Since that time, Mexico has been gyrating in every conceivable direction through the U.S. Supreme Court, through the Texas courts, and through the federal Congress in an attempt to get that international judgment turned into domestic law. And there's a well-known U.S. Supreme Court case, which unfortunately holds against us, called Medellin, where all 9 of the Supreme Court justices recognized that the United States had a binding international obligation to comply with the judgment that was rendered. The judgment's known as the Avena judgment because Mr. Avena has the name that is closest to the beginning of the alphabet. That's the only reason we call it the Avena judgment of the 53 Mexicans that sued. In any event, the U.S. Supreme Court said that, yes, the United States does have a binding obligation to comply with that, but that the U.S. Supreme Court was not going to enforce it because it viewed a treaty obligation as being something that needed to go through the United States Congress. As a consequence of that, Mexico has been working with the United States Congress, and Senator Patrick Leahy, during the summer, introduced or I think it was in the spring, introduced a bill, and I've forgotten the exact name of it, but the gist of the name of the bill is that it's the Consular Notification Compliance Act of 2011. And we are attempting to get that turned into federal law. And if we do, it will prevent imminent executions of a number of Mexicans who are at the end of their appellate rights. That is, they've run out of things that they can do, principally in Texas, because Texas is where they execute people the most quickly. So that is the most direct way that I'm able to connect up international law with the kind of work that I'm doing. And it's a pretty direct way. As a practical matter, what the lawyers, I've got, I think, 35 lawyers now around the country in death penalty hotspots that do the heavy lifting for me. But those lawyers use international law primarily as a means to be heard, that is, a means to give them legal standing to be heard in courts around the country, federal and state courts.
We'll take that opportunity to transition to Terry, and hopefully we'll get Greg back for a question and answer.
Okay. I'm back. Okay, my understanding of my role on this panel is to provide an overview of the global death penalty abolition movement. Because I think in the United States, anything international gets kind of confusing because not many people look outside the borders of the United States. And working with Amnesty International, we're encountered that all the time because people don't know where parts of the world are. But I want to point out that the debate over the death penalty is not only about the use of the death penalty in Oregon, Texas, Georgia, or the United States. It is a debate that has been taking place in countries throughout the world for decades. And the international death penalty abolition movement continues to grow. In 1977, when Amnesty International began its global campaign against the death penalty, It had been abolished in only 16 countries. Now, as the organization's 2010 report called Death Sentences and Executions 2010 shows, nearly 100 countries have stopped using the death penalty for all crimes, with 139 ending it in law or practice. A total of 31 countries abolished the death penalty in law or in practice during the last 10 years. But China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Yemen remain among the most frequent executioners, some in direct contradiction of international human rights law. We are not, as a country, in good company, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of many countries and leaders of the world. Since 2003, less than half of the countries who have the death penalty, who have death penalty laws, have carried out executions. To understand the global abolition movement, I think it's important to move through the regions of the world to document how they use the death penalty. I won't bore you with too much detail, but I think as you're part of a global, or again, you have a map here, let's see how the rest of the world, not just this little part of called the United States, handles the death penalty. Let's look at the Americas. In 2010, the United States of America continued to be the only executioner in the Americas and executed 46 prisoners. That's the bad news. But the good news is that the number of executions carried out in the United States in 2010 decreased over 2009, when 52 people were executed. The use of the death penalty in this country continues to decline compared to the highs of the 1990s, when because now only about a third of death sentences are imposed. At the end of the year, there were more than 3,200 people under the sentence of death in the United States. These executions have occurred, you know the obvious ones: Texas, there's been Ohio, Alabama, Georgia, Arizona. Even Washington State carried out its first execution in many years. However, this trend is changing. In recent years, New York, New Jersey, New Mexico, and Illinois have ended the use of capital punishment. Bills to repeal the death penalty are in 3 legislatures this year, and we hope to add them to the list. That takes care of the Americas. In Asia and the Pacific, although Amnesty International was not able to get figures on China, North Korea, and Singapore, they have been known to carry out hundreds of executions. As it is, we can only document 82, but we know that it is much more. 11 countries in Asia can have the death penalty and impose death sentences, but don't carry out executions, such as Afghanistan, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Thailand. In the Pacific Islands, they are free of the death penalty and executions, and they don't even impose it. And in January of 2010, the president of Mongolia announced a moratorium on executions as a step to abolishing the death penalty. When I read this, I was going, Mongolia? They're aware of it, and they're taking action. In Europe and in Central Asia, in 2009 was the first time there were no executions in Europe or the former Soviet Union. However, last year, Belarus defied that and executed 2 people. And they also sentenced 3 others to death. In the Middle East and North Africa, there were fewer death sentences and executions recorded in 2010 than in 2009. However, when the death penalty was imposed, it was frequently due to unfair trials or offenses such as drug trafficking or adultery. these are not the most serious crimes recognized by international law. Death sentences continue to be imposed in Algeria, Jordan, Kuwait, Tunisia, among other Middle East countries. The Iranian government acknowledged that it executed 252 people, including 5 women and 1 juvenile offender in 2010. Amnesty, however, received reports that another 300 people were not officially counted as being executed, but they were. In sub-Saharan Africa, little Gabon, abolished the death penalty in 2010. That brings the number of countries in the Africa Union that have abolished the death penalty to 16. Now, that only leaves 4 countries in sub-Saharan Africa that have abolished the death penalty: Botswana, Equatorial Guinea, Somalia, and Sudan. As an aside, I work on, besides my death penalty work, I work on human rights in Central Africa as a national volunteer with other country specialists. They call them country specialists. I worked on that case for Equatorial Guinea. There was an urgent action introduced for these 4 military officers. It was of no avail. They were held, they were executed, they were tried before a military court and executed within an hour. Their families were notified. They came running to the prison, hoping to talk to one of them, because one of the 4 had made a specific request to speak to his family. They were turned away and told it was too late. The government dumped their bodies in an unmarked grave. That's the death penalty. Now, state-sanctioned killings continue. There were at least 527 executions in 22 countries in 2010. Not, as I said, not including the thousands in China. And more than 2,000 new death sentences have been known to be handed down, bringing the total to nearly 18,000 people on death row worldwide. 18,000 people. That does mean 18,000 families and loved ones and others who were involved. In 2010, prisoners who were executed were beheaded, electrocuted, hanged, given lethal injection, or shot at close range in the back of the head or heart, or by a firing squad. Sometimes the sentences were carried out in public. Countries that insist on using the death penalty continue to claim they only use it in accordance with international law. However, their actions blatantly contradict those claims. Most of these countries use the death penalty as a convenient way of getting rid of troublesome people or showing that the authorities are tough on crime. Have we heard that one before? It is often imposed after unfair trials or based on confessions extracted through torture. It's often against political opponents, poor people, minorities, or members of racial or ethnic or religious communities. It is sometimes even used against people who allegedly commit crimes while they were under 18 or have significant mental impairments. In violation of international law, death sentences are handed down for acts such as fraud, sorcery, apostasy, drug-induced offenses, or sexual relations between consenting adults, which fall far short of the legal threshold of most serious crimes. In the last year, death sentences were imposed for drug offenses in China, Iran, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Yemen. And the Uganda Parliament saw the introduction of a bill calling for the death penalty for aggravated homosexuality. And in Pakistan, a Christian mother of 5 faced charges of blasphemy and possible death. Incredibly, despite the unmistakable global trend toward abolition, some countries are actually working to expand the numbers of crimes related to the death penalty. They are going opposite of where the world's going, such as Bangladesh, India, Pakistan. At least 2,024 new death sentences have been imposed in 67 countries, as I said before. This is a minimum figure. However, despite these executions, there continues to be progress toward abolition. Many governments have abolished the death penalty but are now advocating its further abolition in their communications with other countries and as part of their human rights policy agendas. A growing body of resolutions, recommendations, and statements have been made in international and regional governmental systems. For example, only 4 countries in the G20 now execute people. They are China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. That means 16 don't. 36 members of the 53 member states of the African Union are abolitionist in law or practice. There are only 4 members of the states of the Commonwealth practice execution. That means 50 do not. 3 members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations executed people in 2010. That means 7 do not. All right. What I will do is just to end what might be a good trade-off for this discussion. 2010, a letter to the members of the United States Congress from the members of the French National Assembly was delivered to our congressman, and it said, "In all candor, that we say to you that maintaining the death penalty in your country profoundly affects the friendship we feel for you. If Americans must understand that the death penalty is intolerable, it is up to you, as responsible politicians, to help them understand that. You are the representatives of a country that certain people consider the greatest democracy in the world, but you were never elected in a model democracy as long as the death penalty exists there." And finally, Kofi Annan, when he was United States Secretary General, upon receiving a petition calling for a worldwide moratorium on the death penalty in 2000, said, "The forfeiture of life is too absolute, too irreversible for one human being to inflict it on another, even when backed by legal process, and I believe the future generations throughout the world will come to agree. Progress toward a global abolition of the death penalty has been made since 2000. We continue to seek more." Thank you.
Greg, we with you. Can you feel us? We can't hear you. I've been in different countries, kind of see how the international dimensions of this works out. Starting with the man right now that I'm with on death row, Manuel Ortiz. He's from El Salvador. And the Vienna Conventions are like a joke in Louisiana. I mean, people know it's there, but they just widely disregard it. I mean, nobody came to Manuel when he was arrested and brought to trial for supposedly killing his ex-wife to gain insurance money. And it was all trumped up stuff. We're just having the hearings now to show his innocence. He had no benefit of counsel. And that's just one example where you can have these international treaties, Vienna Convention, whatever you call it, to the right to seek out your counsel, but it's not abided by. The signal for that is set by our Supreme Court, who have made statements, especially starting in the Reagan years of a harder court, that we're not bound by international law. We follow our own wisdom, our own guidance of our Constitution. And someone like Justice Antonin Scalia has been blatantly dismissive of Europe. Like, yeah, we're all supposed to follow Europe and their human rights. They follow Freud. They don't even follow Jesus. We're Christian. We follow Jesus, yeah. But it's a dismissiveness of we don't take into account international law. And even for those who are people who are strict constructionists like Justice Scalia, when you look at the framers of the Constitution, it was to take treaties seriously, it was to take international relationships seriously. I've been to Japan quite a few times, working with this family, the Furukawas. Their father was a spiritual advisor on death row, meets on death row 2 innocent people, and spent the remaining years of his life trying to free 2 innocent people off a death row in Japan. Japan has a terrible death penalty. There's not a real clear process, so you could be the last one going on to death row, and then you could, a lawyer working with death row inmates in Japan said, the worst time of the day is when you wake up in the morning until 10 in the morning, because if the guard's going to come in and say you're next, it's going to happen by 10 o'clock in the morning. And then he said, so then it's quiet, nobody comes, you're going to live at least for another 24 hours, so you can eat your lunch in a little bit more relaxed way, and then the night comes, which you pray never ends, because the next day begins another round, because the process is not at all clear. And when you are due for the death penalty, when they come for you, they take you out and they hang you. The parents don't know, your family doesn't know. 2 weeks later, they get a letter from the government, and it's interesting language. It says in there, the separation has happened. And that's Japan. Japan follows the United States. I mean, you know, Japan, after World War II, with the presence of our military there and our system of justice, there's no doubt about that. Guantanamo, I have a friend, Denny LaBeouf. It'd be good to get her here, and the whole thing of international law. She's taught in Amsterdam. She's really good. She's taken capital cases in Louisiana. So you talk about a little dirty blouse lawyer. It's Denise LaBeouf. Greg, I don't know if you can hear this. The dirty shirt lawyer, he's smiling. I hope you hear it. But Denny has defended people in Louisiana and the 10 southern states that really do the death penalty. She was part of the John Adams Project, which is to represent defendants in Guantanamo. And they have had massive struggles not to have the military commissions. And the big thing about the military commissions doing people's trials is you cannot have admitted into evidence that you tortured somebody to get their confession. That is not admissible in the military trials. So we have good human rights lawyers. When I talk to young people who are in law school, we have great people working for people where it really makes a difference. Poor people who have nobody to represent them are in this field of international human rights, like defendants in Guantanamo. And Denny LaBeouf is an example of those people. Interesting that in South Africa, the first act of their constitutional court after they did away with apartheid was to get rid of the death penalty. 6:30 on Friday mornings in Pretoria were the time of the hangings, and the women and people would be outside of the jail and the hangings would be taking place 6:30 every Friday morning. I got to meet at one of the international meetings in Rome George Bezos, who was the lawyer for Nelson Mandela. And Nelson Mandela could have been killed so easily, but he had George Bezos by his side, who talked to the judges, who talked about Nelson and his, you know, the positive qualities that went in him, don't hang him, and it was close. It was by a thread. But they walked out of the courtroom, and Nelson Mandela made a little joke to George. Thank you very much, George. I'll be in prison the rest of my life. Thank you very much. And, he's kind of joking like, yeah, you saved me from death, but he didn't have any assurance that he was ever going to be released. And we know the difference of the life of that one man. But it was all, if he hadn't had a George Bezos by his side and thrown into that courtroom one more person, was causing trouble, and that you have to come down in force to stop this, of the black uprising and all this kind of stuff. About our country, too. We were one of the last in the world to say that you couldn't execute juveniles. It was fought tooth and nail by members of the Supreme Court. Juveniles. I mean, look at it. Us in Somalia. And we didn't even sign on the UN Convention for the Rights of the Child, because we knew if we signed on to that, it would mean that we couldn't kill kids anymore. And we resisted signing on to the UN Convention for the Rights of the Child. It was so weird. I put this in my second book, The Death of Innocence. But if you were below 18, you couldn't buy alcohol or drugs, you couldn't sign a legal contract, you couldn't join the army, and you couldn't witness an execution. But you could be executed for doing a crime. And one of the things that turned that finally was when the brain studies came in that showed that until you're in your 20s, your brain isn't fully formed, and that's the reasoning behind not giving young people, areas of responsibility, because they're not fully formed as adults yet. Finally, that was the thing that tipped it over, and the practice in states that were doing away with the practice of killing juveniles, it was enough to sway the court, our court, not to kill juveniles, not to kill people who are mentally challenged. And the really tough people on the court will say things like, don't tell me they're mentally challenged. They know right from wrong. And it's so horrendous to hear the language, which means there's no mitigation. Like, well, doesn't it matter to be a child? Doesn't it matter to have, mental challenges in terms of judgment of what you do, what's humane, where compassion can rule, and which is, of course, the move of the world toward human rights, is that compassion's got to be possible. So, and then I was in Russia. I forget what year it was. It was, I would think, in the early part, like around 2001, maybe 2. See, one of the things that happened with the relationship of Europe with the other countries was that to join the Council of Europe, you had to have a moratorium on the death penalty moving toward its abolition. And we were in Russia right at the time that they were talking about that and moving toward that. We got to meet with the Constitution, with the second highest person on the Constitutional Court. And it was so interesting to see this movement of moving toward international human rights and countries wanting to ally themselves with the Council of Europe because you could have commercial endeavors together, trade and so forth. And in the interest of that, you could see a number of countries under that. You maybe know that better than me, Terry, of how many countries with that relationship with the Council of Europe enacted a moratorium on the death penalty and then to move toward abolition. So the movement of the world is definitely toward it, and also in international human rights. In Rome, you have the International Court of, of criminal appeals? That's what it's called? In Rome. Well, what do the initials mean? International Criminal Court. And that that when Pinochet left Chile, that they made a citizen's arrest of him, and it's under international rules that you can't torture and genocide. And so Pinochet was held. This past year, George W. Bush was going to go to, I think it was either Norway. And Norway is one of the signers on the International Court of not only abiding by the agreement not to torture and not to participate in genocide, but that they would enforce it if anyone stepped on their soil who had in fact engaged in torture. And George W. Bush had openly said about waterboarding. openly said and admitted to it. And so the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, good friend of mine, Bill Quigley, working in there at the time, sent this notice over to Norway to just say George W. Bush was going to visit their country and that he had been a torture open, and they gave him the documentation of Bush's words about openly engaging in waterboarding, and the word got back to the Bush people that Norway was considering, had a moral obligation if he stepped foot in Norway to arrest him for international crimes. And he canceled his trip. So these are some of the things I know about the international connection. Just more and more, we are not going to be able to live in an isolated way. This is the way we do things in the United States. And the deepest values of our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, because our Constitution is a compromise document. We started out compromised. Slaves didn't have a vote. Women didn't have a voice. Only propertied white males had a leading voice in this country. And I think to some extent we're still playing catch up with that, and that's why it's taken us a little longer to join the forces in the world. But because there's just so much between people now, and there's more and more and more. Sandra Day O'Connor, after she got off the court, began to speak more and more about the need for international, listening to international wisdom from other countries, and we're moving in that direction. And all these good young minds sitting in here that are going to graduate from this university, that care about international issues and human rights, and you are going to bring it forward in the world. Whatever job you do, whatever thing you get involved with, you are going to be, carriers of the torch of human rights wherever you go, and I applaud you for that.
Take questions for any of the speakers, and technology will hopefully cooperate with us. Please, questions. Yeah.
I know that Manuel Valle was killed recently using a new lethal injection drug that I believe was manufactured in Denmark. I'm not really sure. But I wonder if any of you know about who is supplying the U.S. with the drugs that we're using now to execute people in the U.S. And if they're in Europe, if there's any sort of legal way that, that since they don't have capital punishment there, that they could somehow say that, they don't want their drugs to be used in that way.
Greg, did you hear the question?
I think the gist of it. If I understood the question right, it was whether companies that are creating the drugs used for the lethal injection cocktail and that are creating them in other countries, whether by virtue of being in those other countries, are they prohibited from those countries that don't have the death penalty? Are those companies prohibited from selling it to the United States? Is that basically the question?
Well, I know they're not, because Denmark, I think, sold us drugs that we used to kill Manuel Valle. So I guess I'm just wondering do they have any legal standing to say you can't use my drugs in this?
Do they have any legal standing to what?
Say that their drugs cannot be used here for that purpose.
The easy and honest answer is I don't know. Once their drugs have gotten to this side of the Atlantic, then they don't have any legal control or obviously physical control over them. And I don't know of other countries' laws that would criminalize their actions for sending our country the drugs that are used to kill people. I suspect that certain countries would be able to criminalize that, but it's it's at this point, what countries have been doing is putting political pressure on them to not produce and sell those drugs, but I've not heard of any criminal prosecutions originating in those countries. It's a good idea, though.
Can he hear me better if I come up?
I think you can.
Yeah.
I can hear you pretty well.
Well, thank you. An interesting thing happened with these drug companies. Can you see me?
Yeah.
With these drug companies, there was one in Italy that was producing the drugs. They got word that they were using it for lethal injections. They shut it down, stopped shipping it. Then there was a group in Denmark doing the same thing. And I was working with lawyers, and they asked me to put my name on this letter to Cardinal Health, that was the distributor of a drug that they were using for lethal injection. Well, the Danish company heard about this letter going to Cardinal Health, and their letter back to me, it was all public. The Associated Press was carrying all the dialogue back and forth. And they heard about it, and they said, well, we didn't know our drug was used. So they shut off their drug. But they have to just do it through compliance, through their own values. There's no international law on that. But again, our Supreme Court is the one that set the tone. They had a hearing about whether or not lethal injection. There is no oversight of what states are doing when they lethally inject people. Oklahoma ran out of the drug recently, and they went to a veterinarian. They got what they needed, and they killed somebody in Oklahoma. There's no oversight, because basically the thinking of the court, and again, my friend Justice Scalia said, pain is supposed to be a part of death. And if you don't know if the anesthetic part of it has knocked them out, slap them around a little bit and see if they're conscious. That happened in the oral arguments before our Supreme Court. So we're all over with this right now, and because the Supreme Court didn't come down on a clear protocol and oversight for the use of drugs, so it's really, I mean, they're doing it secretly and nobody knows what they're doing, and so we're kind of nowhere in terms of really being able to enforce.
Another question?
Yeah.
Speak loud, Kayla.
Okay. I'm sorry, Miss Terry. I have a question about, you mentioned during one of your speeches that there were some countries that sentenced to death but didn't execute, and other countries that did both. Could you please elaborate on that a little bit? Because it seems as though sentencing a citizen to death and not executing them is kind of, you know,
Well,
worthless as far as death penalty goes.
Yeah, well, basically what is happening is there's a category called the retentionists, meaning they keep the law in the books, but they don't execute. The way I understand it is that going to abolition. Look at our country; it's very political. People don't want to do it. They might be considered soft on crimes, but they know that it may not be right, so they hold off on it. So they might, just wait and see, like we do now. People are still being the death penalty is being imposed, but few people are being executed. So, like the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda and some of these countries, they have it, but they don't use it because they're part of Africa continent, and it's changing in that area. So that's.
So does that mean for them that if they are quote unquote sentenced to death, does that mean they actually just spend life in prison if the country doesn't execute?
At this point, until the laws change, they are in prison.
Okay.
Please.
Someone close to me.
Speak up so that Greg can hear you.
Okay. Someone close to me was charged with the death penalty, and the thing that we were kind of amazed to discover was how difficult it is to win a death penalty case in the U.S. Because people assume the public assumes that if someone's charged with the death penalty, that there's a good reason for it, but in this case where the person isn't guilty, it was used as a way to try to force a plea bargain, and because he's innocent, he refused to, so going forward, it's a pretty chilling process to witness how difficult it is to win because of the way the system is so profoundly stacked against defendants. But also, we were told that if he was found guilty, that the evidence, even though there was DNA evidence exonerating, that didn't matter unless the death penalty was first overturned and then the conviction could be overturned. And that's something that almost no one in this country seems to understand about the death penalty, that there's a pervasive sense that if people are on death row, they're probably guilty, except for those occasional mistakes that were made. And I guess I want to ask you to speak to that.
Well, I don't know if I completely understand, but we just went through the trauma of the Troy Davis case, and I went to a national conference in Chicago in January, and we had dinner with the Georgia equivalents of state death penalty abolition coordinators, and I asked them specifically, how can Troy Davis be in the state he's in on death row, given no DNA, 7 of 9 people recanted, no gun, and all that. And the woman who's been following this for years said he was convicted by the jury. And once that happens, it's really hard to go back, to undo that. She said that's what hung over the case. In that case, so if that hadn't happened, or if there is new evidence or something like that, then it's easier. But once the conviction has happened, that's why it's so important for us to go to our local prosecutors when we have the cases and get death penalty off the table right at the prosecutor level.
Greg, were you able to hear that question?
I was. I was just going to add that one of the phenomenon that's present when there is a death penalty case is the jury that is selected to serve on the death penalty. Studies have demonstrated pretty conclusively that death penalty qualified jurors are far more likely to convict than jurors are that have not been death qualified. And when I say death qualified, I'm talking about the procedure that takes place during the voir dire or jury selection process. And under United States Supreme Court law, it is required for, well, I shouldn't say it's required, but prosecutors certainly take advantage of this ruling, that each juror acknowledge that they don't have any moral qualms about imposing the death penalty. That's an overstatement of precisely what the holding is, but that's the way that most judges interpret, most trial court judges at least, interpret what's the requirement for jurors to serve on a jury. So in other words, more than likely nobody that is in this room, the room that you all are in, nobody in that room would be qualified to serve on a jury, and consequently the folks that are technically death qualified to serve on a jury tend to be far more conservative, far more skeptical of defenses, and far more police and prosecution prone.
I think we'll take one more question and then offer our speakers the opportunity for closing remarks if they wish.
I have a question about like higher profile figures like Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, where public opinion is really charged internationally about. Both their executions, and particularly the United States' role in them.
Well, what happened? Basically, Amnesty International is against all executions, no matter what they've done, even if they've done egregious crimes, which obviously Saddam Hussein did. I personally would not want him free, but that doesn't mean I want to execute him. He should be in prison. He should have been in prison for life. Now, the United Nations isn't against the death penalty. I mean, there is a death penalty under specific conditions, such as genocide and so forth. But it's interesting that the International Criminal Court is not allowed to impose a death penalty. So if Saddam Hussein was put before the International Criminal Court, they could not impose a death penalty. However, they could put him in prison for life, which again, from my perspective, would solve the problem.
Okay. Greg won't be commenting on this. Would either of you like to offer some closing thoughts?
Yeah, well, yes, I do. Maybe probably the answer I might give now is what you might wanted before. But I assume all of you are familiar with the Troy Davis case. Well, we work, Amnesty International and the NAACP and many organizations worked on his behalf for this, because there was doubt. I don't know if he did it or not, but there was doubt. And I still remember the evening of the execution, standing in Pioneer Courthouse Square. I don't know if any of you have been in Portland, but I was there, and we were doing our little, vigil and all that business. The time came, and then somebody got a phone message saying the Supreme Court was involved. And that was one of the oddest experiences I've ever had, was to stand there wondering if nine people, the highest court in our land, would say, wait a minute, there's doubt. But they didn't. It took me a couple of days to overcome that. However, there is now another priority case. It's the case of Reggie Clemens. There's a fact sheet and a petition out there. Reggie Clemens, in my opinion, is probably going to be the Troy Davis of March 2012. Because he was set to be executed in November, but the Supreme Court, he would just get out of the stay. Let me point out his case and why Amnesty International wants to stop his execution. One, there's no physical, let me just put a background. He was sentenced to death in 1991 for the murder of two young white women, he's African American, who jumped off a bridge and died. And the case is relevant facts, that's important. But what's really more important in this case is in regard to Reggie Clemens. There was no physical evidence. Two of the witnesses were critical to the conviction. One was a former suspect, and the other was a co-defendant. There was no independent witnesses. There's police coercion alleged. There is prosecutorial misconduct. There was illegal, inadequate legal representation. There are questions of race. There was a stacked jury. These are elements that you find in cases throughout the United States and all over the world. I won't go into all the specific detail, but my feeling is that Troy Davis, when he's dying, he said that do it for the other Troy Davises, and that's what I'm doing. And I know people throughout the world are doing. Thank you.
Greg, any closing thoughts?
I wanted to say thank you very much for inviting me. And then the only other thing I wanted to say, which is slightly off point, but I haven't had a forum to say it to yet, is I think it's really critical for us to not get too hung up on the folks that are actually innocent of the crimes for which they've been convicted and sentenced to death. Because honestly, it's quite easy to say, I don't want to see the death penalty imposed or an execution carried out for somebody who didn't do it. What's more difficult from a moral standpoint is for people to stand up and say, I don't want this person convicted, and I know he did it, and I know that he harmed the victims terribly. And that's what we're talking about most of the time. And the innocent folks that are on death row are important in their own right. They're also important from the publicity standpoint of abolitionists, because it gets people indignant. But I'm hoping that what we can ultimately achieve is to have people indignant about the killing of guilty murderers, because most of the time.
Oh, there he goes again. That's a good point. Very good point.
State-sanctioned murder.
All right.
Yeah, the official diagnosis on the death certificate for Troy Davis was homicide.
On every death
On it, and it's homicide by state. Yeah.
in Texas, they put legal homicide by execution. It's homicide. But you can't put just failure to breathe. Killed a man. Just a couple of things I want to say. When in the late through the 60s and the 70s, there were a lot of people that had people on death row in the southern states. But there was an unofficial moratorium on the death penalty. We were not practicing it. And then, of course, when the Gregg decision of the Supreme Court was done, then states started putting it into practice again. And nobody more than the 10 southern states that had practiced slavery. 80% of all executions go on in the 10 southern states. But you have this de facto question that was asked to Terry. California has over 700 people on death row. The average waiting time for an execution in California is 20 years before a person's executed. So you have to look, what is this phenomenon of over 700? They have more than Texas, more than 700 people, but yet in the legal machinery of the way the death penalty is actually carried out, you wait 20 years before there's an execution. What's driving this? What's the dynamism that makes them fill up their death row with over 700 people? I believe what drives it is political, that people get points, and prosecutors get points from their constituents, shows they're tough on crime, and then they run for higher offices. But the de facto in the practice is always the first thing to watch as we end the death penalty. Texas, Harris County, Houston, on average, 48 death sentences a year. Last year, 2. We haven't executed anybody in Louisiana since 1999. There was one person who was a consensual execution because the lawyers are doing good work and the lawyers are shutting it down. And the lawyers are going and overturning the cases and freeing innocent people. There's not as much enthusiasm for the death penalty as when we started out. So practice is important to follow. And we work for the day to come when it's taken off the books and it's no longer legal. The way New Jersey did, and the way New Mexico did, and the way New York did. Here, you had New York, which had to have the death penalty, and how long? And he had George Pataki ran for governor, and the first thing he did with the assembly was to bring back the death penalty. Well, in 1995, the Supreme Court of New York overturned the statute because it was unconstitutional. And I can remember lawyers telling me how that statute was written. There was no way it was going to pass constitutional muster. And that's another way to stop death. the lawyers that get in there to work, and it made sure that statute was so muddled. That thing was never going to pass constitutional muster. And sure enough, the New York Supreme Court overturned it. Then they had hearings, and people came to the hearings in New York and shut down the death penalty in New York. They spent $200 million to have the death penalty in New York for 9 years, and they had like 4 people or so who were selected to be killed and so forth. So the more we educate people, and the more we follow the way of human rights, I'm really glad Greg ended on that note. And I just want to say that when Tim Robbins, when we did work on the movie of Dead Man Walking, he said, Helen, in this movie we want to make sure the person's guilty, because the key moral question is not what to do about the innocent. We know we shouldn't be executing innocent people, but what when they're guilty and they've done a terrible crime? Can't we have the state kill them? And that's the deep moral question. So, thank you.
Point. Oregon is facing that. A guy who beat another man's head in prison wants to be executed. He wants the state to kill him because he doesn't believe in suicide. That is, we're fighting hard to prevent him volunteering for his own execution because we do not believe that in state-sanctioned murder. He is guilty, and he certainly shouldn't be killed by the state.
I'd like to thank you all for attending. I'd like to thank our guests very much, and especially Greg for his forbearance and patience in joining us in this way. I'd like to also mention that we will continue with various events through the year in our partnership with the Carnegie Council, looking at international dimensions of ethics and as well how they are applied here at home. And I'd also like to tell you that the University of Oregon is a leading institution pushing the boundaries of higher education inside of prison walls. And we're taking our students into the penitentiaries in Oregon for blended classrooms that help to break down some of the societal stereotypes and barriers and prove that people in prison are people with merit and that they have talent and that some of them anyway are eager to learn and are worthy of joining our best students in the educational process. And we hope that all of you look for ways to support this endeavor, which we consider part of the mission of the university. Our guests who are here are available for a little while for questions. Helen is heading up to Salem.
I got to go to Salem.
She's going to Salem, and she'll be in the prison tomorrow morning at 7:30 for her first event tomorrow. So briefly available. But thanks again for coming.